This is the 9th in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. In today's program, I will continue to address the question, can anything significant be done to get human beings to treat each other more decently? Why raise this question? Well, there is a consensus among the great thinkers that there is a dark side to human nature. All the major religions and famous philosophers, psychologists, psychiatrists have zeroed in on the dark side of human nature. And of course, the recent research done on the human genome by some of America's most famous contemporary scientists has also revealed some traits in human nature that we could consider to be part of the dark side of human nature. This is not to deny that there is a positive dimension to human nature. Indeed, making the world better involves cultivating what is positive in us. In my last program, I zeroed in on the role of the individual in making the world a more decent place. And I focused on the individual engaging in introspection, self-examination, examination of one's conscience. And I also zeroed in on the role that education and religion can play in getting human beings to treat each other more decently. This program will provide further amplification on those ideas, and a later program in this series will deal with the role of the social economic system in trying to get human beings to behave more justly, and also the media and punishment, prisons, for example, in, again, possibly getting people to behave more decently towards each other. What do the great religions teach about making the world a more just place? Well, again, in a past program, I emphasized the idea that all the major religions encourage people to engage in daily introspection, self-examination. The Dalai Lama has put it this way, and I'm quoting him: "We must criticize ourselves. How much am I doing about my anger, my hatred, my jealousy, my pride? These are the things we must check on a daily basis." The Jewish sage Maimonides, writing in a similar vein, said we must investigate and repent of evil dispositions in us. Maimonides went on to say, it's not enough to repent of sins such as fornication and theft, but we must also investigate and repent evil dispositions such as a hot temper, jealousy, and the eager pursuit of honors and wealth. The eager pursuit of honors and wealth. He claimed that such dispositions are even graver than sinful acts. Some religions, besides encouraging daily examination of conscience, also intentionally or unintentionally, play on people's fears. The fear, for example, of going to hell. Christianity and Islam, for example, both teach that there is a hell and that those people who sin grievously will be condemned to an eternity in hell. Indeed, Voltaire, the very famous French philosopher, talking about the idea of hell and how this can be used in a positive way to get people to behave better towards each other, said this, and I'm quoting Voltaire: "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him." Voltaire went on to say that he wanted his lawyer, his baker, and his wife to all believe in God and in hell, regardless of whether there is a God or a hell, because if they did believe, that would that would incline them to behave better towards him and other people. Of course, some other religions don't teach so much about going to hell as they do about other bad consequences of doing evil. Both the Buddhists and the Hindus talk about karma. Karma is the law of consequences, the idea that when we do good, we will be rewarded, and when we do bad, we will be punished. Religion, besides fear of punishment, let me rephrase that. Religions, besides using fear of punishment, can also tap into another emotion to improve human behavior. And that emotion is compassion. Compassion involves fellow feeling. I've mentioned in some previous programs that many famous thinkers claim that we are so complicated that while we have an instinct for aggression, we may also have an instinct for compassion. Both the Buddha and Jesus talked about the importance of human beings regarding each other with compassion. Indeed, Jesus in Matthew 5 said this, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, among others, tells us that morality is based on compassion. Morality is based on compassion. It's been said that where there is compassion, even the most poisonous impulses in us remain relatively harmless. Some people claim compassion is a species of intelligence. The idea is that compassionate people see and are aware of the universal suffering in this world. All the religions teach that suffering is inevitable in life, that no one gets out of this life without having done some significant suffering. Indeed, Mother Teresa put it this way, and I'm quoting her, "Suffering will never be completely absent from our lives." What are some historical and contemporary examples of suffering famous people have experienced and endured? Let's start with some famous presidents of the United States. George Washington, of course, was our lead general in the Revolutionary War, our war for independence from Great Britain. The war lasted approximately 8 years, and Washington experienced much adversity in his prosecution of this war. Recruitment of troops was a real problem. Properly supplying the soldiers was a real problem. Historian Joseph Ellis, in his outstanding biography of Washington, entitled His Excellency, tells us that at times during the Revolutionary War, 1/3 of Washington's soldiers had no shoes. Also, Washington experienced many battle disasters during the war. In fact, we came very close to losing the war. Washington lost more battles than he won. Indeed, historian Joseph Ellis says this, and I'm quoting Ellis, "Washington lost more battles than any victorious general in modern history." His critics in government, Washington's critics in government, could not believe that such a supposedly brilliant general could lose so many battles, and therefore he was the object of their criticism. The stakes were very high for Washington and America in the Revolutionary War. What would have been the consequences for Washington of what is now the United States losing the war? Well, his Mount Vernon estate, his plantation, would have been confiscated. His name would have become a slur among Americans, and he almost certainly would have been hanged by the British as a traitor. The most decisive battle in the Revolutionary War was the Battle of Yorktown. It's the battle that turned the tide for America. And Professor Ellis, again in his book entitled His Excellency, A Biography of Washington, says this about our victory in the Battle of Yorktown. And I'm quoting Ellis. "It was as if a spirited but overmatched boxer, reeling and about to collapse from exhaustion, stepped forward in the final round to deliver a knockout punch." I must also add that it's almost certain that we could not have won the battle at Yorktown and probably the Revolutionary War without the assistance of France. Historians tell us at Yorktown, at least half of all the soldiers who fought on the American side were French. Indeed, some historians put the estimate as high as 60%, that perhaps as many as 60% of our fighters at Yorktown were French soldiers. It is interesting that Washington's finest moment in the war was the Battle of Yorktown, but he also suffered a personal disaster in this battle. How so? Well, his stepson, Jack Custis, died while the battle was in progress. It is interesting that George Washington is regarded as the father of our country, but Washington had no natural children. He had 2 children by Martha Washington. Let me rephrase that. He married Martha Washington, a widow, and she had 2 children by a previous marriage, so that Washington had 2 stepchildren. Ellis tells us, and I'm quoting him, Washington was most probably sterile. Washington, the father of our country, was most probably sterile. I mentioned his stepson died during the Revolutionary War, and his stepdaughter, Patsy, died prior to the Revolutionary War at age 17. She had had frequent epileptic fits as a child, and at age 17 died of an epileptic seizure. When the war ended, Washington had been away from home for 8 years. He later, as you know, became President of the United States, our first president. And during his second term as president, Washington was the victim of vitriolic criticism. Politics got very nasty during Washington's second term, and he was accused of kingly ambitions. We now know Washington had no such ambitions. Also, the issue of slavery plagued Washington. You recall in our Declaration of Independence, it says that all men are created equal. But we all know there were more than 1 million slaves in America at the time of the Revolutionary War. And Washington himself owned 124 slaves at his plantation in Virginia. Washington apparently was haunted by the contradiction of the United States supposedly being a democracy and yet condoning and allowing slavery. And what did Washington do about this? Well, in his will, George Washington freed all of his slaves. Another president of the United States, a very famous one, who endured much suffering in his life was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln battled depression for most of his life. And in 1850, 10 years before becoming president of the United States, Lincoln's 4-year-old son, Eddie, died. He was elected president in 1860, but shortly after being elected president, 7 southern states announced they were seceding from the United States. They were leaving the United States because they said they could not bear to live under a President Lincoln who was on record as saying he did not want slavery to expand in the United States. Some opposition newspapers to Lincoln described him as a baboon. Lincoln, like Washington, was the object of nasty criticism in some newspapers in America. While the Civil War was on for 4 years, Lincoln regularly visited the battlefields and witnessed much suffering. About 1 million men and boys either died or were wounded in the Civil War. Lincoln observed many 18 and 19-year-old boys who suffered amputations of arms and legs, for example. Also, during the Civil War, Lincoln endured another personal tragedy in that his 11-year-old son, Willie, died in the White House of an incurable illness. His wife now went into a depression, and indeed, Lincoln's wife now suffered a nervous breakdown. And of course, shortly after our victory in the Civil War, I should say the North's victory in the Civil War, Lincoln was assassinated. Indeed, he was shot at point-blank range. Another president of the United States who experienced great tragedy was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt became president of the United States in the midst of the greatest economic depression the United States had ever experienced. He was elected president in 1932, and indeed was elected president for 4 consecutive terms, a record. When FDR became president, 25% of working Americans were out of work. That's an incredible unemployment rate, 25%. Many people were losing their homes and farms because they could not pay their mortgages. In addition to the nation's problems, Roosevelt also had to deal with personal problems. Roosevelt was a victim of paralysis. Roosevelt was paralyzed from the waist down. He could not walk. He wore heavy leg braces. By the way, this paralysis took place before FDR became president. Indeed, when he was elected president, he was already in a wheelchair, and indeed would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. As I indicated, he wore heavy braces and could not walk unassisted. If you see newsreels of Roosevelt standing or walking, you will notice he's always holding on to some other person. Roosevelt, besides the Depression, had to deal with World War II. 7 years after being elected President of the United States, the world found itself in a great war. And Roosevelt had to deal with this. Indeed, from 1941 to 1945, the United States participated in this war. By the time we entered the war, Adolf Hitler had taken over approximately 10 countries. And one wonders what would have happened if Hitler had won the war. So again, Roosevelt was confronted with great responsibility, not only in dealing with the economic depression the country was facing, but with this great war that we were fighting. Roosevelt, like Lincoln, like Washington, endured vitriolic criticism. Indeed, his economic policies especially made him the target of criticism. Many opposition newspapers claimed that Roosevelt was destroying capitalism. Roosevelt, of course, believed that at this time we needed big government, and he instituted, with the help of Congress, all kinds of social welfare programs. For example, Social Security, and other programs to help people to hold on to their homes and farmers. So Roosevelt instituted what became known as big government, expensive government. And of course, as a result of this, taxes went up. And rich people had to assume a major burden in terms of paying the taxes that would make this big government possible. And many rich people came to see Roosevelt as the enemy, even though Roosevelt himself was a very wealthy man. Also, Roosevelt's marriage, as far as we know, was not a particularly successful one. He was married to Eleanor Roosevelt, who in her own right became very famous. There is very significant evidence, really overwhelming evidence, that while Roosevelt was President of the United States, he had a girlfriend. Another President of the United States who endured much suffering was John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had Addison's disease. He suffered from constant back pain. One leg was shorter than the other. Prior to becoming president, Kennedy had an operation hoping to alleviate some of his pain. The operation did not succeed. Indeed, he almost died. He came so close to death that the last rites were administered to him. As you probably know, the last rites is a sacrament of the Catholic Church administered to people who are close to death. In the 1960 presidential race with Richard Nixon, Kennedy was in so much pain that his doctors injected him with cortisone to help relieve the pain. The cortisone had one positive result, and that is this, that Kennedy, by all accounts, was a very slender, almost scrawny-looking person. But the cortisone shots gave his face a fuller look, and when he participated in the debates with Richard Nixon on television, the result of the cortisone was to give his face a much more handsome look, in contrast to the often scrawny way in which he appeared in person before taking the cortisone shots. Kennedy also did not have the ideal marriage. Kennedy had a very strong sex drive. And again, there is significant, if not overwhelming evidence that while president, Kennedy engaged in extramarital sexual affairs. And of course, another president who experienced much suffering was Lyndon Johnson, a Texan, a man who was born into a family of very modest means, but who became a rather wealthy man. Even though Johnson was a Texan, he came to be hated by many Southerners. Why so? Well, Johnson spearheaded the civil rights movement, at least among politicians. He spearheaded the civil rights movement to make America a more just country in its relationship to black people. Johnson, in 1964, signed the Civil Rights Act, ending segregation in public places in America. The following year, he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which attempted to guarantee black people the right to vote. It was an attempt to do away with all kinds of gimmicks Southern states had instituted after the Civil War to prevent black people from voting. Well, it's interesting. Johnson, this Texan's efforts to make America a more just place for black people, was not welcomed by many Southern bigots. And indeed, Johnson predicted that the South, which had voted Democratic for the Democratic Party in past elections, indeed, Johnson himself was a Democrat, he predicted that the Democratic Party would lose much influence in Congress. And that indeed happened, where Southern states, one after the other, began regularly voting Republican. Johnson, while he was president, also endured the criticism of, of the Vietnam War and America's performance in the Vietnam War. It was on Johnson's watch that we lost the Vietnam War. Actually, the treaty was signed during President Nixon's administration, but it was during Johnson's presidency that things went really badly for the United States in Vietnam. More than 50,000 American men and boys died in that war. And as I said before, Johnson and his administration came under harsh criticism for the way in which we prosecuted the war. Indeed, after Lyndon Johnson died, his wife said that Johnson suffered from severe depression during the latter stages of his presidency as things began to go very badly in Vietnam. And Lady Bird Johnson, again, after her husband's death, claimed he may have been clinically depressed in the last 2 years of his presidency. She claims she was very worried about his mental health. And of course, we know Richard Nixon succeeded Johnson as president, and he also endured much hardship during his presidency. We know that Nixon became the first president to resign from the presidency, and indeed resigned in disgrace. I see I'm running short on time. Next week, I will continue with a recitation of some of the suffering famous people, not just presidents of the United States, have endured. And again, we'll try to point out why I think this is important to do in a program on human nature. But right now, as usual, I would like to close with an idea from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, in Walden, his masterpiece, reminds us that we are all artists. He penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the greatest of arts."